Okay, so hello again. Welcome to our lecture 4 on the Indus Valley. We're going to be talking about the earliest city structures that we find in South Asian Peninsula and slightly outside. And it's going to be great. We're going to cover from that to the ancient world. Okay, so the very first. Let's just stop. Okay, so the very earliest urban culture with extensive agriculture being practiced in the South Asian Peninsula is going to be known as the Indus Valley culture. That's because you find cities, settlements, smaller urban settlements, and evidence of trade, communication networks, language being used in this basin that follows the Indus River and its tributaries. This territory is kind of between, a lot of it is in modern Pakistan now, and it involves this region right here. Okay, so the two main cities, the largest cities of this region are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and they have some very unique figures and they have some very unique features. Now, I should note before we move on that the Indus Valley civilization is quite unique, and part of what makes it unique is the level to which it's kind of mysterious. We're not entirely certain. They did have a written language, but that written language has not been translated. We're not entirely certain what groups of people they might have been related to, exactly how they developed before they began building large urban centers, exactly how their culture was organized. There's a lot that's sort of mysterious about it, including what happened to cause the Indus Valley centers to decentralize and kind of fade away toward the end of the period where they were present. So there's a lot of really interesting questions that we have about the Indus Valley culture, and there's a lot of really cool evidence that we can evaluate, but a great deal that we don't know as well. Okay, so some of the things that are absolutely tantalizing about the Harappan cities that survive are just how complex and really polished they are from an urban planning perspective. The city of Mohenjo-daro, for instance, is laid out, and I'll show you the next slide, on really, really neat grids. So neat, in fact, that there's almost no chance that it happened organically. In other words, the city itself seems to be a planned city. And that would suggest there had been an earlier community, an earlier city, and a collection of tens of thousands of people, because the population did appear to be more than 10,000 people, who all at once decided we'll build a city from scratch, lay it all out, put it all together neatly, and then move into it. So it could be they had a city before that got destroyed. It could be that they consolidated out of a group of smaller centers. No one really knows. No one knows how this happened. But the city of Mohenjo-daro had a lot of really advanced features in it. It had, as you can see here in this picture, public water repositories. It had baths, it had fountains, it had wells, it had drainage systems to take away dirty water. It had all kinds of public amenities inside the city itself. As I mentioned, it had these really neatly laid out streets and buildings. They're all very straight. You see the same kind of phenomenon in places where towns and cities are planned first and then built. Some areas or completely rebuilt from scratch after former ones are destroyed, but there's no signs of that in Mohenjo-daro. So if you look at Manhattan, you can see the streets are laid out on a neat grid, or Washington, D.C., they're all sort of laid out very neatly. But if you go to a city that kind of grew up organically, like Paris, over time, or even Syracuse over time, you can find that the streets are kind of all sort of wonky. They curve around various features. They go kind of squiggly. They're at weird angles to each other. Some are narrower than others. And that's not what you find in Mohenjo-daro. Instead, everything is very, very neat and very consistent, which points to the fact that it was planned first and then built. Or really substantially rebuilt, so there was no trace of a former city on top of it, which seems unlikely. So the other thing that's really kind of interesting about the architecture of the city, this Harappan city, is that there's no sign of a palace. There's really not much that you find, kind of like Çatalhöyük back in, we were talking about the sort of Epipaleolithic and the new Neolithic settlements in the Fertile Crescent. There's no real sign of a lot of class difference. Most of these houses are all the same size. They don't really have much difference in the material stuff you find inside them. There's no real indication of sort of a separate part of the city for the upper class or the lower class. There's no sign of a king. There's no none of the things that we often do find in Bronze Age cities, and so it's a little perplexing. That adds to the mystery of it. What's going on here? Did the people who live in this very complex, highly organized city, who practiced intensive agriculture, did they not have a ruling class like that, where they ruled collectively as part of a democracy or a republic? Did they have a ruling class that just didn't live in the city? We don't really know what's going on, and so it's very enticing to speculate and very exciting. Okay, so some of the stuff that does survive, as I mentioned, they had a written language, and you can see some examples of it on these, a few of these examples of the surviving types of inscriptions. These are known as the seals. So these are the seal stamps, where they seem to be made, and they are mostly made out of stone or clay, and they're used to make impressions in stone or clay. So the top would be what we would actually find. So you have this block, and it's got like impressions in it, and then if you squish it into some soft clay, what you get is the reverse. So you get a little symbol, and the first one you can see there's that's either a horse or a cow. I think it's a horse. You see like a horse with some writing on top of it and some other sort of symbols around it. The middle one is a cow. You can see the horns, or a bull, and then the last one's an elephant. And so you have these seals, and there's writing, and those symbols on top are clearly some kind of script. It hasn't been deciphered, and we don't know what it says. Part of the reason it hasn't been deciphered is that we just don't have very many examples of it. So we have seals like this, where we'll have what appears to be perhaps names or just a word or two, but it's so little to go on, and we have nothing to match it to. And the symbols themselves, we have no idea whether they represent sounds or whether they represent whole ideas or words. We don't know. But it hasn't been deciphered, and we don't know what it reads. But it does show that they had a written language and used it. Also, the seals themselves, there's a lot of speculation about what they were for. They're really common. A lot of them were found. And so one of the possible explanations is that this was something that was used by merchants or people who participated in the long distance trade that the cities rely on, and so they would stamp their symbol on their particular goods that were being shipped further afield for sale or for purchase. We don't really know, though. It could be that every household had one of these, and this is how they marked stuff that was for their household. We don't know what they're for, but there were lots of them, and they're pretty cool. There's a little bit of evidence, and it sounds kind of basic, that you can draw from the seal stamps. The animals that are depicted in them, kind of like we talked about with the cave art back in the day, the animals that are depicted in very realistic fashions. Along those same lines, you can see here is a copper plate from that same Harappan period, and it shows the longest inscription, I believe, that we have in this Harappan script. It really is that's as long as it is. It's really very short, so it's tantalizing because we can see there is a written language. It even has some illustration. You see a seated figure, some kind of cup, there's a flower. We just don't know what this means or what it could refer to, and so it's part of the great mystery that is the Indus Valley culture, this Indus Valley script, which we haven't translated. Some of the material goods associated with the Harappan culture include quite advanced bronze casting and bronze making. The most famous of those kind of artistic pieces is this one. This is the dancing girl figurine. She's a national treasure. She dates from between 2300 and 1750 BC, which is really remarkable for this sophisticated level of bronze casting. And she's made using something called a lost wax technique, which is something that later sculptors are going to use extensively. So you see this in the Renaissance. You see it in various others, like Rodin does lost wax stuff. Anyway, this figure, we're not entirely sure what she signifies, but she does appear to be culturally significant, not just because of the creation of this bronze figurine by itself, which somebody clearly went to a lot of effort to make, but also we see symbols elsewhere on carved in stone and on pottery that looks kind of reminiscent of that pose. If you see that carving there, you might have to use your imagination a little bit, but you see what looks like a figure with a hand on a hip, kind of like the dancing girl has, and holding something, and it's kind of broken, but it's a tantalizing suggestion that this dancing girl represented someone in particular, that this was part of a story, that this figure was a familiar one, and that people would know what it would have meant, and that it had some kind of religious or cultural or symbolic significance to people that we just don't know what it is. So again, part of the mystery, again, part of the really cool artifacts that we see from the Harappan culture. Okay, so we don't have a deciphered script, so we don't really understand the writing left behind by the Indus Valley civilizations. And even if we had deciphered it, it might not tell us very much because we just don't have very many examples from it. But these cultures, the Indus Valley civilizations, were really large. They're very sophisticated. They have long distance trade networks. They're bringing in the materials for copper and tin to make bronze. They're bringing in all kinds of different goods from outside. They're shipping their own materials out. The cities themselves don't really show a ton of import goods, which is kind of odd. They produce a lot of what they use themselves, it appears, in textiles and pottery and all kinds of other things. Their cities have really thorough planning. They have lots of amenities. They have clean water. They have administrative centers. It seems really cool and advanced. They also were huge, even by the standards of Egyptian cities and Mesopotamian cities. They had 40,000 to 80,000 people in them, which for the ancient world, for the Bronze Age, is enormous. These are really big cities. So what happens to them? We're not entirely sure. Sometime around 1900 BC, the cities appear to be abandoned. There's decentralization. We don't really know what went on. Perhaps it was climate change, crop failure. We don't really know. What we do know is that sometime, somewhere, right around maybe 1500 BC or a little bit afterwards, a new group of people seems to migrate into the South Asian peninsula. And their language group seems to have originated in, I guess you could say, Central Eurasia, kind of between Europe and Asia, as it were. And the language group has been called by linguists Indo-European. And speakers of this language seem to have sort of dispersed around the world. So it's not one group traveling everywhere. It's just that people who speak this language group seem to have spread across into Europe and then also into Asia, kind of both directions. And so there are a lot of modern languages that are descended from this language group. And one of those modern languages is Sanskrit. That's a written language in northern India. And so these Indo-European speakers seem to have moved into northern India sometime around 1500, and we see the development of a new culture. This particular culture is going to focus on these kind of northern, just south of the Himalayas region of India, and especially into the Ganges Valley and along its tributaries. So the very earliest culture that was building big cities in the Indian subcontinent is the Harappan culture over in the Indus Valley, but this is a second wave that's focused in a little bit of a different region, very much in the north and in the Ganges River basin. They will eventually spread. So this is going to be the linguistic origin. Okay, so the period where Sanskrit emerges and where these new Indo-European speakers move into northern India is described as the Vedic period. And it's in part named after one of the most important texts that is generated in that period. One of the earliest texts that we have from the Indian subcontinent. The first written versions of it date to about the 4th century BCE, but they're probably composed based on linguistic clues and other clues inside the text as early as 1800 BCE, and portions of it probably more likely about 1200 BCE, but definitely a lot longer, a lot earlier than it was written down. And so the whole period is referred to as the Vedic period based on the name for this kind of a hymn. And so the Rig Veda gives us lots of important insights into culture, religion, philosophy, and we're going to talk about it as one of our primary sources. Okay, so other texts from this time, specifically the Laws of Manu, are going to give us some other bits and pieces of clues as to how society was organized. And one of the things that you should be aware of is something called the Varna system. And the Varna system emerges in this Vedic period as the precursor to a caste system. It's not a caste system yet, but it does organize society into 4 hierarchical classes: the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. And the Brahmins are put at the highest sort of level. These are scholars and priests and teachers, and they are considered kind of the highest class of society. The Kshatriyas are warriors and rulers and administrators, and sometimes it's a little surprising to students that rulers are not necessarily considered the highest level of society according to the Varna system, because the highest level is reserved for Brahmins, who are sort of dedicated to a more spiritual path, if you will. And it's understood that you can't really get your hands dirty and be a ruler and still be fully on that pure path. And so the Kshatriyas are put kind of second, but they're pretty high ranking. Then you have the Vaishyas, which are ordinary people. They're farmers and merchants and people who are just kind of like the salt of the earth people. And then Shudras, this is the class for people who are laborers, who are servants, who are considered kind of working class or lower class people. And a bunch of the Laws of Manu kind of describe, this is another one of our primary sources, we'll talk about it, some of the assumed rules that should be in place that organizes how these classes interact with each other. And as you read through the Laws of Manu excerpt that we have, I want you to reflect a little bit, because you can take some of what the laws say in a couple of ways. Like, for instance, the Laws of Manu on marriage will forbid people who are Brahmins or people who are Kshatriyas, people who are higher caste, or they're not really caste yet, I shouldn't have said that, who are higher up in the Varna system, from marrying or having romantic intrigues with Shudra women, for instance. And while this does reflect a certain kind of class arrogance or a class snobbery, it could also be understood as being a kindness, as by making this something that is forbidden, it prevents people who are higher in social standing from taking advantage of those who are lower in social standing and are more vulnerable and have less ability to stand up for themselves or to achieve an equal relationship. So sometimes the rules that you find associated, like with the Laws of Manu, they reinforce this system, but they're not necessarily just one-sided about creating an exploitative or an oppressive regime. Okay, well, the regions are referred to as the Janapadas. And so these little regional kingdoms or regional units of governance, these Janapadas, are going to kind of spring up through the Ganges Valley and along the tributaries and this whole kind of region right just south of the Himalayas. Now, this is part of a monsoon environment, and so it's seasonally very wet and seasonally very dry, and you have to have a lot of advanced planning in order to make sure that you save enough water for when you need it. And it's really kind of a challenging environment, much like we saw with Mesopotamia and Egypt. And so it really requires people to have a certain level of social organization to make it work. When these Janapadas consolidate into larger regional governments, those are referred to as the Mahajanapadas. So they're kind of the big Janapadas, the consolidated ones. And you start to see a lot of those emerging sometime around 500 BCE. There's a lot of them kind of forming and creating these small empires, like the Kuru Empire. It's one of the earliest of these kind of Mahajanapadas that form into a regional power. The ruler of a Mahajanapada is called a Maharaja. It makes sense that would be the word that's derived from the same origin. At any rate, these small Mahajanapadas end up in competition with each other. Sometimes one will emerge as powerful and regionally dominant. Occasionally, like the Kuru Empire, they'll get really quite expansive and take over big regions. However, I want to emphasize, unlike Egypt, which is really united politically, a lot of its history, northern Egypt, southern Egypt, Middle East, it's all connected. The Indian subcontinent is very diverse. You have people of multiple language groups, multiple religious backgrounds, kind of multiple farm-based economy systems. You have multiple everything. And it's not that common to see, especially early on, large regional empires maintaining control for long periods of time. Okay, so the Kuru Empire, what are some of the things that they introduce as they grow in strength and influence? They introduce some of the earliest coinage that is found in the Indian subcontinent. The advantage of coinage over just trade in goods or in raw ingots of metal is that it creates a uniform unit of currency, so you don't have to measure out how much everything is worth. It's kind of guaranteed by the government to be worth a certain amount and have a certain amount of purity of metal in it. And it's a system that helps governments end up managing how much money is in circulation, and they can start to make some macroeconomic maneuverings with their economies. That's a little down the road yet, but that will happen. They're also famous for producing a style of pottery, very lovely style of pottery called painted grayware. And it's going to be produced all over and traded, and it's going to be a distinctive feature of the Kuru Empire. Okay, so between 600 and 530 BCE, there's going to be the emergence of another extraordinarily powerful society. And this one will form a huge and hugely diverse regional empire. It's going to be called Achaemenid Persia. And it's first going to really expand to get its kind of full extent under Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is going to employ a bunch of techniques that are famously consistently useful in trying to create an empire like this. Cyrus is going to use a time-honored tradition. If you want to establish a huge regional empire, here's the fast way you do it. Okay. You get a big army together. This is a greatly simplified version. Get a big army together, you roll up to a nearby town. You give them an ultimatum. Join us or die. If they join you, you ask them for tribute, that they pay tax money to you and that they provide some dudes for your army. And if they decide to resist, then you fight them. If you beat them, here's the trick. If you beat these people who've resisted, you don't just kill them. That would defeat the purpose. Instead, you offer them a deal. If they will join up at this point, you'll give them the same sweet offer you were going to make before. You have them pay you some taxes, you have them supply some guys for the army, you have them come to an arrangement where they're going to keep public order. Sometimes you get a regional governor. In the case of the Persians, they're called satraps that you put in charge. But generally speaking, you don't ask a lot of them. Often you'll do something as a sign of good faith, like build a temple or provide them some kind of benefit they need, protect them from some of their enemies who might be lingering around, give them an opportunity to participate in your trade network. There's both a carrot and a stick here. Is the way it works. You offer them as many benefits as possible, and you're kind to them in this initial defeat. So they take the deal, they sign the treaty, you roll them into your empire, you take the guys that they provided for the army, and your army is now bigger. And you roll up to the next town, and you have an even bigger army, and you do the same thing over and over again. Join us or die, and every time you're victorious, the army gets bigger. And every time the army gets bigger, the towns that you encounter are less likely to resist and more likely to join. Eventually, they start volunteering to join. People hear that there is an empire that can provide security, that can provide access to a massive trade network, that can provide stability, that can do things like build roads and temples and things that they might want. And there are places that will just get ahead of it and be like, well, I think we'll join, and send messengers and volunteer to be part of the empire. There are others that resist, and sometimes they're successful and oftentimes they're not. But you establish a big regional empire. Frequently, this is how it works. You get the big army, you roll more people into the army. Every time you're victorious, the army gets bigger. Cyrus uses a bunch of other techniques as well, which are kind of interesting and worth knowing. We'll talk more about them later, but he's very, very, very politically skilled. And one of the ways he'll convince a region to join or to give up if they're in the middle of fighting him is that he'll seek out groups of the population that are unhappy with the current regime. He'll find people who are oppressed, either because they're a religious minority or because they are an ethnic minority or because they're a class minority, whatever reason they're feeling oppressed. And he will give them an offer and be like, if you switch to my side and throw your resources in with me and do what you can to undermine the people resisting me in the place that you're from, then I will fix things for you. I will restore you to your ancient homeland if you've been displaced. I will build you a fabulous temple to your put upon God. I will allow you to join my army and become part of my state and not discriminate against you. He's really, really good at that kind of thing. He's excellent at this kind of technique, and we'll talk about what effect that has in some of our primary source readings for this week.